Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we're going to talk more about farming itself, and to do that, the first thing that I want to do is to define some terms. So let's talk about the farming inputs. This is all the stuff that's necessary for actually farming, and you can divide that in the inputs into two categories. You've got your natural inputs, so climate, what are the general weather patterns going to be like? How much precipitation do you get? And then also the geography or topography of the land. The other thing that's going to be really important here too is going to be the geology of the soil itself. And I forgot to put that on the slide, but that's going to be included there too. And then the stuff that we put into the actual farming process, that's the human input, and that's going to be the labor, right? And it takes a lot of labor to farm, right? And we know this is labor intensive. Although with all of our machinery, we need fewer people to do the same jobs, right? But we're going to have fertilizer, pesticides, any water that we bring in that's not coming from rainfall, anything we have to divert or pump, right? All of that stuff. And then we have the actual farming processes. That's the activities specific to whatever kind of farming that you are doing, right? So that's going to be the plowing, tilling, planting, right? Harvesting, all of the things that go with harvesting. And remember, different crops require different inputs, require different processes, and then of course our different outputs, right? The output is the actual product, the crop itself. And again, I'm talking about it in terms of plant products, but we are also talking about animal products. All of these definitions apply to animals as well. All right, so what is the goal of farming? So whether you're talking about commercial or subsistence agriculture, there are going to be 5 characteristics that we're going to kind of group things into, right? And so you've got this idea of what is the purpose? Commercial versus subsistence. Commercial farming is going to have a completely different purpose than subsistence farming. Farm sizes, commercial farms are going to be bigger than subsistence farms, right? The percentage of the farmers actually in the labor force, and part of that goes to how much machinery you have, right? The relationship of the farming to other businesses, how involved is that particular farm in the economic activity of the region, and then also the use of machinery, right? Obviously, commercial and subsistence agriculture is going to have a huge difference in the type of machinery that they're using, right? So in the purpose of farming, obviously, subsistence farms are family farms in terms of feeding the family. We have been subsistence farming for thousands of years, and the most typical farms that you'll see in the least developed countries are going to be subsistence farms. Commercial farms, this is where you are producing stuff for sale. And this does not mean family farm versus commercial farm. Most farms in the United States actually are family farms, and they are commercial farms because they're producing whatever it is they're growing for sale, right? So that's modern farms. Even subsistence farms actually do try and grow enough to have some to trade or some to sell, but the primary focus of that is going to be to actually grow the food for the farm, right, on subsistence farms, okay? Even if they may have some to sell. The most common farms in the most developed countries are going to be the commercial farms, as I mentioned earlier. All right, so what about the workforce? When you look around the world, when you look at these commercial farms, first of all, you can have fewer farmers, fewer laborers producing a lot more because of the machinery that they have, right? But then when you move to some of the least developed countries, right, when you're looking at sub-Saharan Africa and Central, South, and East Asia, you're going to have 50%. I mean, these have huge rural areas. These are going to be strictly subsistence farms. They don't have the big machinery. They're going to need a lot of people doing it. And also, remember, each family is farming for themselves. And so most people are involved in subsistence farming there. So you have more than 50% of the labor force actually involved in farming, okay? When you talk about tractors, farmland per tractor, this really will tell you that you have heavy machinery farms versus hand-managed farms, right? And so look, again, when you have all that commercial agriculture, right, you're going to have lots of tractors. So a tractor for every 50 acres or less. But then when you start talking about these subsistence farms, these are managed by hand, right? And so you don't have a lot of tractors. Now, types of agriculture. You're going to have different kinds of agriculture in LDCs than you do in MDCs, right? Least developed versus most developed countries. And what you see a lot in LDCs is going to be shifting cultivation. And there are really two features that describe shifting cultivation. And this is a really important thing because it's also a huge environmental issue, right? This is what we call the slash and burn agriculture, and this is what is happening to rainforests. All over the world. You are having people go in and burn down the forests. They can only farm there for a few years because the soil is notoriously nutrient poor, and that's why they actually burn all the trees, because when you burn the trees down, you not only clear the land, but that ash is nutrient rich, and so it mixes in with the soil, and so for a time you have some pretty good soil. But after those nutrients are gone, then you have to start putting in lots of fertilizer. That's really expensive, and so they just move to a new plot. The types of crops grown in shifting cultivation are going to vary depending on where you are in the world, and traditionally the land is actually not owned by individuals, whereas in the rest of the world farms are owned by farmers or commercial agribusiness, right? But in these cases, a lot of times it's just not unclaimed land, but it's state land or something like that. So getting a picture of shifting cultivation, where do you think it takes place most commonly? So you're thinking about forested areas, because remember, you're burning down forests typically. I mean, you can do slash and burn anywhere, right? But it's typically done in forests. So where do you find your largest forests and your least nutrient-rich soil? Well, that's going to be in tropical rainforests. So shifting cultivation commonly takes place in tropical and subtropical regions. Now, this type of agriculture in these areas is going to be what we call intensive subsistence. Intensive means that you are maximizing production, you are growing lots of different crops, it's heavy labor, right? You are really working the land to its maximum capability. There is no waste of land, right? And you can see there's a lot of polyculture, right? You've got all this polyculture going on. You're usually going to find this in areas of high population with high agricultural density. So typically, right, that's going to describe subsistence just in general. All right, and a lot of rice actually is really intensive subsistence farming. In the United States here, right, and in some places in Europe, a couple of places in Africa, right, you have more commercial rice production, but when you're talking about some of these other places in South and East Asia, you're talking about a lot of subsistence farming, although there is quite a bit of commercial rice farming in China. All right, now you also are going to find in addition to this shifting cultivation, this very intensive subsistence farming, you're going to see a lot of livestock, because remember, if you're subsistence farming, you probably also are going to be raising your own livestock. So you've got this mixed crop and livestock farming. Most of the land is going to be devoted to crop. Most of your profits are going to be derived from the livestock, okay? And so that brings us to the idea also of dairy farming. You have a lot of dairy farming, but again, it's subsistence. And the regional distribution of dairying is called the milk shed, right? And so each area has a local milk shed, because there are two primary challenges to dairy farming. One, and this is not actually, this is in terms of the actual farming, it's very labor intensive and it's expensive to maintain livestock when you don't have ample supply of grass or grain. So winter feed is necessary, and that's very expensive to buy. But the other challenge that you have in terms of dairy farming is the fact that it is perishable, right? And so there's a limited amount of travel that milk products can sustain or withstand, right? That you can't take it further. Anyway, you get the point. Okay, so milk production, where do we have lots of milk production? all over the world, right? There is lots of milk all over the world. Um, so yeah, I don't really know what else to say that. Lots of people drink milk. But think back to our lactose tolerance conversations too about dairying, yeah. Okay, so what else? You're also going to find plantation farms. Now, plantation farms are typically commercial. They typically grow what we call cash crops, okay? Each plantation will usually specialize in only one or two cash crops, but there are lots of plantations out there. You need a huge labor force. They're usually in fairly low density areas in terms of population density. You're going to find them predominantly in those tropical and subtropical regions. Typically, the products are sold to the most developed countries, and so you're really looking at things like coffee, sugarcane, cotton, rubber, tobacco, tea, chocolate, right? All of those things are big cash crops. Okay. Interestingly enough, bananas are also a cash crop. But they are a food crop as well, but they fall into this plantation farming too. All right, so let's compare that to the most developed countries. Typically, in most developed countries, you're going to have more grain farming. Grain farming is very extensive. It can be intensive in LDCs, but typically you're going to find it in the MDCs because you need a lot of space to grow grain because it's grass. You need giant grasslands. So it's typically extensive. The largest commercial producer of grain actually is the United States, but grain is grown all over the world, and as we know from our conversations about corn and wheat, corn is grown in lots of places, although we are the #1 producer of that. And wheat can be actually grown anywhere. Now, the other thing that we see is a lot of livestock. We have lots of commercial livestock ranching in the United States. Now, sometimes that's a mixed thing where you get grain or grass and livestock, both are commercial, but a lot of times you have a separation between those two. Now, the other type of agriculture you see in MDCs is what we call Mediterranean agriculture, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Mediterranean agriculture is horticulture. Right, and horticulture is when we are growing these more labor-intensive crops. Really good example of that would be olives, right? Your fruit crops, things like that. Nut crops, those kinds of things. There is a little bit of difference between commercial gardening and fruit farming, even though Mediterranean agriculture may grow some of the fruits that we're talking about. I was just talking about olives and some fruits, but when we talk about commercial gardening and fruit farming, we're talking about more your truck farms and your market gardens. Usually you have one or more vegetable or crop grown. It's specifically for a far market. Whereas horticulture is going to be lots of polyculture. And again, we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, so let's talk about commercial grain farming. Again, it's extensive. We just talked about that. There are lots of different grains that are grown. The big ones are wheat, rice, and corn. Rice we see a lot in Texas and Louisiana and the lowlands of Arkansas and California. We are the largest producer of corn, followed by China and Brazil. And then, like I said, wheat is grown all around the world, and it can range from the arid regions in Australia to the cold steppes of Ukraine, to the grasslands in South America, to the Great Plains of the United States, right? That's our breadbasket. So as you can see from this, wheat is grown everywhere. Rice is a little bit more limited. Corn actually is, like I said, grown in lots of places. Rice is a little bit more limited simply because it needs water when it's in the seedling phase, and so you have to have huge access to water. And then, of course, here is corn. So your next question is, which of the following is the most extensive type of subsistence agriculture? So remember, extensive means that it takes up lots and lots of space. There's less labor involved, and it's usually lower productivity per sort of unit area. So shifting cultivation tends to be intensive subsistence. Urban subsistence farming is also very intensive. Rice farming is high labor, right? So nomadic herding actually is the answer to this question, and we've been doing nomadic herding for thousands of years, right? As long as we have been growing things, and probably longer actually. I mean, we didn't really need to domesticate things ultimately, and that's how we began domesticating things. But even following herds, we could start manipulating those. So we've been doing this a really long time. We then, of course, as we know, get control of animals, we domesticate them, and then that brings us into the modern day of commercial livestock. We raise cattle, hogs, sheep, goats, ducks, chickens, turkeys, right, whatever. One of the most developed areas where we raise feed for cattle and hogs, and then we also raise lots of cattle and hogs. That's going to be again in the Midwest, right? Those Midwestern states, and corn and soybeans, typically the feed, as opposed to Europe, where feed crops are often oats and potatoes, because that is what they are growing more of, lots and lots of oats specifically. You can also find really heavy regions of livestock ranching in Brazil and South Africa. And most of the time you're going to find around the world crop and animal raising on the same farm when you're talking about, especially in LDCs with these intensive subsistence farms. Okay, and when you look at meat production in general, you can see there are regions, and this was what I was talking about with the cattle. Interestingly, though, in Europe, you're going to find a lot of sheep, the same thing in North Africa. And then, of course, you've got little goats, sheep also, lots of sheep in Australia, although there's lots of cattle in Australia too. It's just that there are more sheep. And then goats, Indonesia, right? And you can read the rest of it. Okay, now cows, not just for meat, there's going to be dairying, right? And so you have really two products with cattle. You have meat and you have milk, right? Both of those things are going to require large-scale usage of pastures. Having said that, though, dairy cows really do need more pasture land, right? In colder regions, you're going to have winter feed, right? Because you're not slaughtering them for meat. You're going to actually have to continue their lifespan for more than a year, right? Now, remember that the milk shed is limited because milk is perishable. Having said that, though, there are lots of longer lasting products that are made. And so if you have a dairy farm in a remote area, it's typically going to specialize in cheeses, right? Maybe butter, maybe yogurt, but this is going to be something that's going to be able to be stored. Now, commercial meat and dairy, sometimes, definitely for commercial meat, you have feedlot systems. You'll see these a lot where you have a high density of whatever the animal is, in this case, because we're talking about meat and dairy, we're talking about cows. But remember, you'll also have feed like, you know, warehouse chickens and warehouse turkeys and things like that. So these are kind of like factory farms. They're just factory ranches, yeah? And they'll have way more cows than your family operated farms, okay? Typically have lots of jobs, right? And they're highly profitable in terms of agribusiness as opposed to family farming. Now, Mediterranean farming, this again is horticulture, and this is where you have mixed crops. It's polyculture, it's intensive, it's highly specialized. You usually grow 3 things, right? And so you have a grain in the rainy season, then you have a drought-resistant vine or tree crop like grapes, olives, and figs, and then you also will herd livestock, typically sheep or goats. The stock raising is not integrated with the crop cultivation, but you have these 3 sort of separate things that you're doing at any given time, okay? And so horticulture is really defined by which of the following? Really simple tools and no draft animals. Okay, remember you're talking about small spaces in a Mediterranean climate, in a Mediterranean geography, and so you have not a lot of room for tractors, not a lot of room for draft animals. So everything's really simple, okay, and small livestock, right? So what do the regions that practice Mediterranean farming all have in common? They all border the seas. Summers are hot and dry, winters are wet with moderate temperatures, land is hilly and mountainous. All of these describe Mediterranean farming, or none of these describe Mediterranean farming. Well, all of these actually describe Mediterranean farming. You have the ocean there. So you've got real variable seasons. Summers are typically hot and dry. Winters are going to be wet, but they're not too cold. And back to that, not having tractors and stuff like that, because the land is really hilly and mountainous in these regions. Okay. Now, the last type of farming that we want to talk about in most developed nations or most developed countries is market gardening and truck farming. This is really specialized. This is where you have no livestock. It's typically fruits, vegetables, and vines. And usually farms are going to focus on a single product, whether it is grapes or oranges, right, citrus fruits, apples, all of your tree crops, your leafy greens, potatoes, right, whatever, right? All of those things. The entire farm output is raised for sale. And this is different than the Mediterranean farming because sometimes that's intensive subsistence. It really describes a method and an area where you have farming, and that method is geared towards that particular region. But in the case of market gardening and truck farming, you can really do it anywhere that you can grow any of these crops. Ooh, pumpkins, right? That's a vine crop. Cantaloupes, cucumbers, all of those things. You usually have a cooperative marketing arrangement, which means that a bunch of farms will form a group together and they'll either trade with each other or they will all go to like a farmer's market together. They're often dependent on the seasonal farm laborers, which you probably know better as migrant workers, and they are found in the most developed countries. They're often near major urban centers who want the specialty crops, right? And you've seen a lot of trends over the last few years of the farm to table and the boutique restaurants and the boutique farming. All of that is market gardening and truck farming. Okay, so how does eating locally grown food in season save energy? Because one of the things that you can do if you want to be more environmentally friendly is look for locally grown food that is in season. Well, if you're looking to save energy, right, you want to look at what is going to require energy, and transportation requires energy. You can save energy because local food doesn't have to be transported. You don't have to have the petroleum that you're using. You don't have to have any of the refrigeration, right, all of that. And so you can really save energy. Locally grown food, first of all, fertilizers typically aren't petroleum based, because they're going to be a nitrogen thing. But you probably do use fertilizers. Locally grown food may or may not use pesticides. It may be using other methods, integrated pest management or whatever, right? And that's not necessarily going to be an energy thing anyway, because you're going to have to protect your crops from pesticide or from pests no matter how you do it. So that requires energy. Same thing with fertilizer. You do support local farmers, and that's a great thing. Locally grown food supports local farmers, and that supports your economy. So you can save energy and support your local economy at the same time. It's very exciting. All right. So we change the natural ecosystems and the actual geography of the land when we are trying to grow food, because we have to change it so that we can use it to the best of its ability. And so we actually reshape the land on a regular basis. We already talked about slash and burn agriculture. But shifting cultivation is considered as what type of agriculture? Okay, so I just want to remind you that shifting cultivation is intensive subsistence, and I want to make sure that you have got a good hold on extensive versus intensive and commercial versus subsistence. So please make sure that you understand the difference between those two things. All right, then we have paddy farming. In order to do this, you really need to terrace the land and you need to make these little ponds. There's a lot of high water usage. You have to flood the area to actually make wetlands to grow the rice, and then you have to either transplant it someplace else or you have to dry these areas out and grow. So there's a lot of change here. And again, most of your rice paddies are actually terraced. Now, just because you have terrace farming and that's where you make these steps in the hillside, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are growing rice. It happens to be a great way to grow rice is by terracing, because you can really control the water. The problem with this, though, this terracing, is that you take away the big root systems of trees that used to be on these mountainsides, and while the leveling of it can slow water runoff and can slow erosion as long as you have the crop growing, right? When you are in that seedling phase of the rice, you don't have those intensive root systems, and when you've harvested your crops, you take away those extensive root systems, and so you can actually increase erosion and flooding depending on when your rainy season happens in relation to when the crops are most productive. Okay. And then just here's another picture of terracing so you can kind of see how it works. We also divert huge amounts of water, and we have actually changed the courses of rivers. We make dams, so we make lakes. We channelize rivers so they flow fast and they don't meander anymore. We actually have diverted so much water out of the Colorado River that it no longer flows to the ocean. That's a dry riverbed where it actually is supposed to be flowing into the ocean. And it's not just surface water. We withdraw huge amounts of groundwater, and water tables all over the world are actually falling because we use so much more water than is actually put back into the ground through precipitation. So we make huge changes to the land in agriculture, and we'll be talking about these more as we go through the course. So that is it for today. If you have any questions, please either put them on the video notes board or ask me in class. And thanks for listening. I will see you next time.